HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents América del Norte by Nicolás Medina Mora. Read by Bellido. It is not enough to look at the exploited classes. You also have to look at the exploiting classes. Louis Althusser. Events travel through time and grow faint in the distance until they seem to become past. But there are certain regions of the spirit where all that has come to pass remains present. What happened continues to happen. It lives on, a luminous ghost fluttering in the vastness of the night. This is why a watcher of the skies who stood on a particular star and pointed his most powerful telescope toward our world would see, at this very hour, Hernán Cortés and his soldiers gazing over the valley of Anahuac for the first time. Alfonso Reyes. Because America has swallowed the entire world. This is why I am writing in English, and not you writing in Spanish. Heriberto Yepes. All the characters in this novel, especially the real ones, are imaginary. Prologue, Mexico City, September 1847. In which the outcome of this tale is revealed from the start. Entre las naciones, como entre los amantes. Like the Spaniards before them, the Americans landed in Veracruz and marched west, away from the malarial fevers of the Tierra Caliente and up the jagged slopes of the Sierra Madre, past taciturn agaves and stern oyameles, and the blinding snowcaps of half-asleep volcanoes, until they reached the high valley where the air was thin and clear, and the white light of the autumn sun fell vertical and merciless on the ill-defended capital, casting angular shadows on the barricades where the remnants of an army of barefoot conscripts whiled away their final moments, dulling terror with liquor and gambling, gathering stones to throw when their obsolete muskets ran out of ammunition. Not so much resolved as resigned to die in a futile stand against an enemy destined to rule the continent. The truth, however, is that none of it was fated. At the start of the 19th century, conflict between Mexico and America was likely, but not inevitable. The war that transformed the United States from an uneasy federation of small Atlantic republics into a global empire was but one of infinite possible outcomes. Trusting coexistence grounded on commerce, friendship born from shared commitments to self-determination, even a gradual blurring of the lines that in due time could have brought about the death of two nation-states founded on genocide and slavery, and given birth to a North American commune. But history is the transmutation of contingency into necessity, and what need not happen did. In the cool hours before dawn on September 12, 1847, the artillerymen of the United States Army trained their howitzers on the last significant fortification between them and Mexico City. Chapultepec Castle, a stone complex atop a steep hill, built as a manor, that now housed a military academy. 16-inch rounds began falling on walls adorned with ornate masonry, but offering scant cover. The 1,000 men of the garrison, among them cadets as young as 13, had no choice but to stand under fire for 12 hours, watching shrapnel tear and shred their friends. The following day, hundreds of U.S. Marines charged up the hill, taking cover behind venerable cypresses, decorated with long hanging moss, dear alike to Cortés and Moctezuma. When they reached the parapet, they leaned sieged ladders against the walls and began to climb in a swarm. At first the Marines died in scores, their bodies tumbling on their brothers and dragging them to their deaths. But they were many, and their adversaries were few. By mid-morning the defenders had been overrun. In the years after the battle dust settled, the Mexican Republic would try to make sense of the humiliation it had suffered. The future had looked so promising just decades earlier, when New Spain broke free from its hemophiliac metropole to become one of the largest countries in the world, a vast realm, rich in silver and in people, that stretched from the forests of Oregon to the jungles of Darien. Now, however, Mexico City had been conquered a second time. How to look in the mirror? What to tell the young? The factual record offered no answers, and so the nation's patriotic scribes reached for myth, or rather for epic, a form where the beauty of heroism is enough to redeem defeat. The scribblers set out to find Hectors for their North American Troy, and found them in the cadets of Chapultepec. Over the course of countless retellings, the memory of the child soldiers underwent a process not unlike the one Freud describes in the interpretation of dreams. Truths too painful to contemplate became half-truths, which in turn became wish-fulfilling fantasies, which were then passed off as truths. The logic of literature replaced that of history. Non-fiction became fiction. Soon, the central story Mexicans told about the war was the tale of a handful of boys who'd fought to the end, long after all hope was lost, retreating to the highest tower, rather than surrendering with their older comrades. When the Marines reached the platform, the last surviving cadet tore the Mexican flag from its pole, wrapped it around his adolescent body, and leaped off the cliff. The dream work allowed Mexicans to convince themselves that the Americans had defeated them, not because they were worthier, but merely because they were stronger. But to believe one's fantasies is the definition of madness. And so perhaps it would behoove us to counter the epic of the heroic children with another tale. One taken from history, rather than from dreams. A few weeks before the cadets of Chapultepec committed ritual suicide, a very different young Mexican arrived in Washington for a secret audience with the Secretary of State, James Buchanan, who would later become president. His mission was simple, if not easy. Negotiate an informal agreement that would protect the interests of the Mexican aristocracy. The secret agent, Don Luciano Fernando Arteaga y Salazar, was the scion of an old family from Durango, a horse-breeding clan whose founder had received his hacienda in recognition of his services to Cortés. He'd been sent to England at a young age to receive a proper education, then traveled the continent armed with letters of recommendation that introduced him to the best minds of the age. By the time he returned to Mexico, he'd become something rarer and more dangerous than a cosmopolite, a translator. When it became obvious that the war was lost, the notables of Mexico City summoned Arteaga y Salazar to a private meeting at the country estate of the Archbishop's illegitimate son. They explained that while patriotic honor demanded that they continue to publicly support the war effort, their responsibility as unacknowledged stewards of the nation compelled them to look at things unsentimentally. The countless revolutions and counter-revolutions that had kept the country on fire ever since independence suggested that the people of Mexico were simply incapable of pursuing their own best interests. Reunion with Spain was not only impossible, but also undesirable. The notables remembered the condescension with which their peninsular cousins had treated them, but the American invasion, perfidious as it was, offered an unexpected opportunity. And so Arteaga y Salazar assumed a false name and sailed from Campeche to Philadelphia, where he made contact with American agents. On that day in September, however, almost nobody in Mexico City knew of the young translator and his secret mission. After the fall of Chapultepec, the surviving Mexican forces fought on throughout the day, putting up fierce resistance near San Cosme. But then, at nightfall, the Americans fired artillery shells on the crowded city center. The Mexican commander-in-chief, Don Antonio López de Santa Anna, that one-legged Simón Bolívar impersonator, gathered the dregs of his army and quietly abandoned the capital, declaring that he hoped to spare its inhabitants a week of house-to-house butchery, followed by nights of looting and rape. It was only much later that the people of Mexico learned that Santa Anna's retreat had nothing to do with protecting the innocent, and everything to do with the agreement Arteaga y Salazar had brokered in Washington. At dawn on September 14th, the Americans marched into Mexico City. Terrified of ambushes, they advanced in perfect silence, surprised to encounter no resistance. As rumors spread, crowds gathered on rooftops to watch the ghostly procession of the conquerors. Once his troops had secured the central plaza, the Zócalo, General Winfield Scott, known to favor fuss and feathers, dressed in parade uniform and mounted a handsome white horse, hoping to cut a fine stamp on his entrada. He rode onto the square, where he supervised the raising of the stars and stripes, and reviewed his triumphant ranks as they broke into a spontaneous rendition of Yankee Doodle. The corpulent general took possession of the National Palace and climbed to the balcony to address his troops and the people they'd conquered. He'd just begun a pompous speech when a group of women who'd gathered in the plaza interrupted him with heckles. "Cállate, puerco!" Then a shot went off from some high window, wounding a U.S. officer in the leg. The Americans turned their cannon on the crowd and opened fire with grape-shot munitions. When news of the victory reached Washington, the American Republic debated just how much land to annex. Some rallied behind the cry of all of Mexico, arguing with the governor of Virginia that slavery should pour itself abroad without restraint and find no limit but the Southern Ocean. But in the end, the rulers of the newborn empire decided to keep only the northern half of the country they'd defeated. Their reasons, in the words of one Senator Calhoun, Democrat of South Carolina, were straightforward. To incorporate Mexico would be the very first instance of the kind of incorporating an Indian race, for more than half of the Mexicans are Indians. I protest against such a union as that. Ours, sir, is the government of a white race. The great misfortunes of Spanish America are to be traced to the fatal error of placing these colored races on an equality with the white race. The dream of a united North America was forever lost. The two nations were never joined, neither in marriage nor by conquest, and instead remained divided by a line, so thin as to be invisible, so stark as to be impassable, that cut not just across the land, but also through the heart. It should come as no surprise that love between their children became impossible. Part 1. Mexico City, May 2016. In which your correspondent returns to his hometown to apply for an American visa, tours his father's new house, chats about political theory with his bodyguard, has uncomfortable encounters with old friends, gets lost on the way to La Condesa, attends horrible parties, ponders the Second Mexican Empire and the tragic fate of his godfather, visits his grandmother, reads Alfonso Reyes, and, in general, feels out of place. Volverte a ver. ¿Vives del otro lado? Said the elderly officer at the Mexico City airport. That's correct. How long are you staying? Couple weeks. Seeing family? No. I mean, yes. That too, but I'm here to apply for a new American visa. The officer raised an eyebrow. Of course, he muttered. Why else would you come back? He stamped my passport and handed it to me. Bienvenido, paisano, he went on, using the Mexican government's official term of endearment for citizens living in the United States. Se vende. Casa Porfiriana. My father's new house stood on the edge of downtown. The neighborhood had become fashionable again only in recent years, but it was developed in the late 19th century, when the owners of a successful circus decided to get into real estate. Emboldened by the improbable prestige of their most famous performer, an English clown who earned the esteem of General Porfirio Diaz, the dictator who ruled for 30 years before the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution, the impresarios bought a large tract of land on what was then the city's outskirts. They commissioned a group of well-regarded architects to build elegant houses designed to appeal to the city's elite. Betraying their colonial anxieties, they christened the development after a fashionable European city, Colonia Roma. Much of the neighborhood was built before 1910, when the uprising against the dictatorship tempered the high-end real estate market. My father's new house, however, dated from 1917, the year when the victorious rebels promulgated a new constitution. The date helped explain the house's reactionary architecture. Unlike most buildings in La Roma, which took their cues from the townhouses of London or the Grand Maison of Paris, my father's house evoked a Spanish colonial palazzo. It was built for a man who made a fortune speculating on rubber. The kind of guy who gets a kick out of pretending he's an hacendado paying his respects to the viceroy before returning to his acreage in Durango. Every detail, from the tile pattern on the courtyard floor to the molding on the edges of the balconies, seemed designed to incite nostalgia for New Spain. When I toured the house for the first time, I saw a familiar volume on one of the shelves, a stuffy anthology of English-language poetry someone had given me when I was 16. I realized the shelf held the books I'd left in the house where I grew up, far away from La Roma, at the western edge of Mexico City. That neighborhood was called El Contadero, because it used to be a small town where farmers counted their livestock on the way to the city markets. Oyamel forests surrounded the houses. Early in the morning, heading to school, I saw old men driving mule-drawn wagons piled high with firewood. The air smelled like tree sap and wet dirt. In the weeks before the feast of the Virgin of Guadalupe, white and blue garlands appeared over the avenues, almost forming a canopy. I last saw El Contadero in the summer of 2009, before I left for college in the United States. A few months later, my father's political fortunes took a turn for the worse, and he and the rest of my family left for a diplomatic post in London. I received an email from my mother. We've sold the house in El Contadero, but don't worry, we put your books in storage. Sitting in a filthy dorm room in New Haven, I was surprised to discover that, for all my determination to leave the past behind, I was devastated by the thought that the tree sap, the wet dirt, the garlands, the oyameles, the mule wagons, and the patch of sunlight that fell on my bedroom floor between 10 in the morning and noon were lost forever. "Everything all right?" my father said. I realized I'd been standing in the middle of the living room for several minutes, staring at the furniture in silence. "Yes, the house is beautiful. Thanks. It was a bargain." Café gratis con su desayuno. By then, most of the people who'd once wanted to kill me were dead or in prison. Besides, my father was now a Supreme Court justice, a far safer job than his earlier position as Attorney General. Still, the government insisted on assigning me bodyguards as a matter of protocol. The new guy was called Moises. He was a mid-ranking officer of the federal police. I bought him breakfast and discovered he was going to night school for a graduate degree in political theory. I asked who his favorite thinker was. He answered without hesitation, Gramsci. Over café con leche, he told me about his previous assignment, guarding a senator in a northern state. Once, he said, his team had escorted the principal to a party at a hacienda deep in the desert. On the way back, a group of uniformed men stopped their convoy at what looked like a military checkpoint. It quickly became apparent the men were not government soldiers. The car with the principal sped off, but Moises and his partner were unable to get away. Dozens of armed men surrounded them. His partner wanted to hand over their weapons, but Moises knew better. "If you surrender, they'll just torture you for information and dump your body somewhere in the Sierra. And if they don't find your body, you're presumed missing, and your wife doesn't get her widow's pension. So it's always better to go down right away. That way, you can take a few fuckers with you." One of the men walked to Moises's side of the car and tried to open the door. Moises kicked it as hard as he could, hitting the narco in the face. "Ya te cargó la chingada, hijo de tu puta madre!" Moises yelled, his gun to the man's head. The narco laughed. A large man in a military uniform appeared behind him and pointed a revolver at Moises. "Do you know who we are, oficial? We're the Zetas. But who are you? Intelligence? Judicial investigations?" Moises pulled out his ID with his free hand and waved it at the man. "I'm a bodyguard." "Who's your principal?" "Your whore of a mother." The fat man laughed again. "Ah, caray, oficial. Si estás bien pinche loco, ¿verdad?" "I'll tell you what. If you put down your gun, I'll do the same." "No fucking way." There was a moment of silence. Then, to Moises's surprise, the man lowered his revolver. "You can go, but tell your principal not to come back here without permission." Moises asked if he could have another coffee. I blinked in disbelief and asked why he thought the Zetas had let him go. "No clue. Maybe they wanted to send a message to the senator?" We never told him, of course. He woke up back home with a headache. No idea what had happened. Anyway, I'm happy to be here now. I'd much rather talk about Gramsci, and drink café con leche, then shout at fat narcos. Police work's a bitch. Mejorar la raza. The word criollo comes to Spanish from the Portuguese crioulo, the substantive form of the verb criar, to breed or to educate. In current Spanish usage, the term can refer to a horse whose phenotype suggests a good pedigree, but whose ancestry cannot be certified. In the caste system that organized life in colonial Mexico, it designated the descendants of Spaniards born in the Americas. The word used to carry an aftertaste of dust and mold, but around the time I went back to the capital to apply for a new visa, I began finding it in contemporary contexts. An article in the left-wing newspaper of Mexico City criticized the Mexican delegation to the Bogotá Book Fair for inviting only Creole writers. An acquaintance studying in the United States wrote an essay apologizing for his Creole privilege. A stranger on Twitter dug up 9 generations of my family tree to show we were descendants of Agustín de Iturbide, the first and only sovereign of the First Mexican Empire, an incompetent megalomaniac who ruled for less than a year immediately after independence, a fact the stranger took, not unfairly, as evidence that an inbred Creole mafia ran the country. All of which raised a question. Were the Creoles white? By skin tone and social position, certainly. In the eyes of the WASPs I met in college, however, all Mexicans, even those of unmixed European ancestry, were metaphysically brown. The proposition was absurd, but so was race thinking in general. In America, a single drop of non-European blood meant one would never be truly white. In Mexico, every additional drop of European blood made one progressively whiter. Hence the awful phrase one still heard at Creole family gatherings, when some great aunt learned a cousin was marrying a blonde. Vas a mejorar la raza. You're going to improve the race. You're going to better the stock. You're going to breed fine horses. El alimentador de zumbido. 2 weeks before I flew to Mexico City, I asked my editor to join me for a cigarette downstairs. "What's up?" he said, eyes on his phone. "News is breaking, so make it quick." I got into the writing program at Iowa. By then I'd lived in the United States for 7 years. I emigrated at 18, in theory to go to college at Yale, in practice to get away from the indolence and paranoia of the Mexican ruling class. After I graduated, I scrambled to find a job that would sponsor me for a visa. And to my relief, I was hired as a police reporter at a New York website that was pivoting from cheeky quizzes to serious journalism. I soon found a large group of friends who worked for little magazines, fell in love with a Shakespearean actress, and moved into her apartment in Crown Heights. For a while, I was happy in the knowledge that I didn't have to be a writer, that I could be a scribbler who read Charles Reznikoff on the way to the NYPD's monthly press conferences. But then I grew restless. I watched with jealousy as my friends graduated from interns to staffers and began publishing their first books. Meanwhile, I spent my days composing copy rather than prose. One night, after an exhausting day at the newsroom, I looked up the application requirements for the Iowa nonfiction writing program and decided to take my chances. A few months later, the department chair called to let me know I'd been admitted. I was elated, but did I really want to leave New York? My friends? My girlfriend? I didn't, but I did want to be a writer. "Congratulations," my editor said. "Where do you want to go for your goodbye drinks? Old Town is closed for repairs, but I'm sure they'll be open 2 weeks from now. The program doesn't start until August, so hopefully by then." "Sebas, we aren't waiting until August to have your goodbye drinks. You just gave your 2-week notice." "Wait, what?" I'd hoped to keep my job until the week before the start of the program, mostly because I wanted time to say goodbye to my friends and my girlfriend, but also because the procedure to change my immigration status from guest worker to international student would take at least a couple of months. The bosses don't like keeping people around once they know they're leaving. But what about my visa? If you fire me, nobody's firing you, Sebas. You quit. And indeed I had, I thought, as I recounted the conversation to Moises while he drove me to the family tailor to get a new suit made. "See, that's the problem," he said. "You don't want to be just a writer. You want to be an American writer." Contingencia ambiental. The rainy season came late that year, the exhaust of millions of cars lingering in the atmosphere. The air tasted metallic, burned the eyes, stung the throat. Mornings were filled with rituals. Vaseline for the lips, small doses of antihistamines, a saltwater nasal spray. The government issued frequent advisories against outdoor exercise. Jogging for an hour in Mexico City, a concerned voice repeated on the radio, harmed your lungs as much as a pack of cigarettes. That claim seemed dubious to me, but the absence of rain implied the absence of clouds, which meant it was 90 degrees in the shade. This presented two choices: close the windows and stew in sweat, or open them and drown in mucus. Either way, you suffocated in moisture. Se ofrecen tutorías para el GRE y el GMAT. It had been 2 days since my sister Inés, the artist, locked herself in her bedroom. My father asked me to summon her to breakfast. I suspected he didn't dare to do it himself. I knocked. No answer. I put my ear to the door and whispered, in the most cheerful tone I could muster, that her food was getting cold. "If I eat," she said, "I'm pretty sure I'd throw up." She'd been like this since she returned from Portland a few months earlier. The mailroom at her college had lost her application for a work permit, which meant she missed a crucial immigration deadline, which meant that, 60 days after graduation, she was on a plane to Mexico City with all her worldly possessions and no exit strategy. That shouldn't have been a terrible fate, but she hadn't lived in the country since she was 15, when our family moved to Britain. I used to think she'd been lucky for leaving so soon. She was spared the cruelties that Mexican private schools reserve for intelligent women, either an ostracism verging on torture, or an anxious popularity bought at the cost of an eating disorder, and the constant performance of idiocy. She was aware, of course. For her undergraduate thesis, she'd made an installation in which a set of bulletproof glass panes hung from the ceiling, suggesting the ghost of an SUV like the one our bodyguards used to drive. On each of the windows, she etched the contours of British pastoral paintings: rolling hills, peaceful steeples, a country house overlooking a moor. She called the work both/neither, but it was clear which term she found more welcoming. "Can I come in?" "Sure." I found her pale and sickly, her thick duvet lifted halfway up her neck, her face all but buried in the folds of a black and white bathrobe that had whimsical panda ears sewn onto the oversized hood. "It's going to be okay. We're going to get you out of here. Have you thought about going to art school in the U.S.? That would get you a visa. I'm already working on an application for an MBA. Since when are you interested in business?" "I figured it'd be my best bet. You know, for a company to sponsor me." Guia Roji. On my third day in the capital, I walked out of my father's house to visit Esteban, one of two friends from Mexico with whom I'd stayed in close contact. He lived nearby, about 15 minutes by foot, but I had to look up the route on Google Maps. I didn't know that part of town well. I didn't know it at all. Before I left for college, I wasn't allowed to walk in the street. Bodyguards drove me everywhere, even the few blocks to my godfather's house. I waved Moises away, and said I would prefer to go on my own, but I harbored the secret hope he'd refuse. That way, I'd at least be able to say I tried. To my surprise, he waved back and returned to the armored car, and his photocopied Walter Benjamin. I headed down the avenue, took a left onto a one-way street, and began counting the blocks to the boulevard that separates La Roma from La Condesa. 1, 2, 3, 10, 12. Could I have missed it? I walked for 10, 20, 30 minutes before I was forced to admit I was lost. I took out my phone to look at Google Maps again, but my American telecom company didn't provide service in Mexico. By the time I showed up at Esteban's place, he'd waited for more than an hour. "Finally," he said when he opened the door. "I was starting to worry the cartel had gotten to you." He led me into the apartment and took me to the darkroom he'd set up in the bath, covering the windows with black paper. Dozens of prints hung from a clothesline, dripping chemicals over the shower tiles. "Are you doing still photography now?" "Nah, these are for the documentary." He took a print from the line, pulled a red-tinted flashlight from his pocket and shined it on the photograph. It was hard to make out the details, but I could tell the image showed.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?